afternoon in the cause of Carson and Redmond. So I've written a dual biography, and the first question that I'd like to pose briefly is, why has there been nothing like this before? And I think the question is worth asking because it does perhaps reveal something about the overall shape, the ups and downs and the lacunae within modern Irish political biography and modern Irish political history. It's not that comparative biography is a particularly unusual genre outside of this island in terms of political history writing, but it is the case that there's not much of it within the island. There are some attempts and endeavours, but on the whole it's a comparatively a rare bird. And I'd suggest that this is perhaps because the kinds of connection that are demanded by an exercise of this kind still cut across acute political sensitivities. Comparing constitutional nationalists with physical force separatists again involves a set of comparative nationalists, even where we are now at the beginning of the 21st century, tramps on certain sensitive political toes. I think it's also the case that the two lives have been separated out by the division of the island into two popular and opposing political narratives. And it seems to me that we bandy the notion of partitionist history around, and rightly so, but partitionist history in one definition is surely dealing with Irish nationalists and Irish unionists exclusively within their separate silos and ignoring common political environments and cross-fertilisation and cross-communication, however fractious that cross-communication might sometimes be. With Redmond and Carson, I think the parallels are clear, though are very rarely emphasised. They are of the same generation, both from the mid-1850s. They were educated at the same university, Trinity College. They each signed up here at King's Inns, and indeed the signatures, as I've just seen, are proudly on display. And of course, the corollary of that is that they pursued the same profession and coincided within the same circuits and sometimes indeed in the same cases in courts. There's some overlap in their personal circumstances. Each of them were widowed, and they each of them remarried. With each of them, there is a strong degree of political mixing in terms, and religious mixing in terms of their background and heritage. Redmond has relatives who were 1798 insurgents, as well as those who might be deemed as being, in effect, loyalists. Carson had relatives who were separatists. They're both marginal to the movements that they came to lead. Redmond, a Parnellite, of course, came to lead an Irish party dominated by anti-Parnellism. Carson, a Dublin unionist, came to lead an Irish unionist party dominated by the North. And they both led what one might describe as vociferous movements, fissile movements which had violent tinges or components, and they both had to devise strategies which held their collective enterprises together. And indeed, I think understanding each of them is partly about understanding the skill with which they each held their respective enterprises together. They were both lawyers who broke the law, albeit in different ways and with a clearly different magnitude. Redmond was briefly imprisoned for intimidation. Carson was not, though his culpability in defying the ban on the importation of weapons into Ireland was and is clear. He signed off on the Larne gun running of April 1914. The two men sat together for 26 years in the one United Kingdom Parliament. They were tireless political opponents, but professed a friendship and a mutual respect, and some of the documentary evidence for this is presented in the book. One was a Home Rule nationalist, the other an Irish Unionist, yet they shared some, well, frankly, in the early 21st century, rather unfashionable, well, what would become unfashionable political principles. Monarchism, imperialism, each of them were anti-suffragist, and each of them perhaps in a slightly more interesting way were federalist in their sympathies, and I'll return to that in a moment. And of course contemporaries of all kinds, from the king to cartoonists, routinely linked them, and even their own families. Harry Carson and Louis Redmond Howard came together in presenting a number of critiques of their elders. One of my minor discoveries in excavating for this volume was a co-written one-act melodrama that Carson Jr. and John Redmond's nephew co-wrote in 1914, genially exploiting the fame of their respective elders in the interests of a quick buck at the peak of the Home Rule crisis. Yet from the time of partition onwards, they have rarely been brought together, and they have never really been compared in a sustained way. So let me work through some of these observations insofar as time permits, and let me try to say a little bit more. They were, as I've said, of the same Irish generation, but there are differences, and these differences have to be acknowledged. Redmond's parents were estranged, as Dermot Malidi, in his fine 2-volume biography, has emphasised. Carson, it's clear from the family record, was a favoured sibling in a relatively stable family environment. Redmond was from the Catholic, professional and landed classes, and there's a bit of money in those networks. Carson's family was Aravist. There's money there as well, but there's also hints of a somewhat disreputable quality, which is perhaps borne out by the naked calisthenics that we've been hearing about by way of introduction. Though I have to say that when I was writing the book and thinking about this talk, naked calisthenics were not quite in my mind. Carson is not a landed Protestant, and there's evidence to suggest that the family at the time of Carson Sr.'s death were left in what's described in family letters as straitened circumstances. In other words, Redmond, I think, was materially secure, but personally insecure in terms of background. Carson was well anchored in his family affections, but he felt materially threatened until the day he died. It's always struck me in reading Carson's letters and correspondence over many years how much the themes of his putative impending bankruptcy feature in those letters, how much the theme of fatal or potentially terminal ill health feature in those letters. And as many of you will be aware, he dies at the age of 81, leaving behind the equivalent of nearly 10 million euros. They each studied together here at King's Inns. They pursued the same legal career, but the similarities end with this. I think Carson can be defined by his legal career in ways which don't apply to John Redmond. Carson's success in the law generates a leverage within a parliament which is increasingly professional in its makeup and its values. And even with his enemies, I hesitate to invoke Tim Healy with Frank about to speak, but Healy on the whole is reverent towards Carson as a political and legal opponent in a way that he doesn't, or using a set of sympathies that he certainly doesn't extend to John Redmond. Carson's legal career, I think, was reaching its peak at more or less the moment that Home Rule was returning to centre stage in 1910. That coincidence is sometimes lost sight of. he's defending George Archer Shee, the Winslow boy, in early 1910, at more or less the same time that he's accepting the leadership of the Irish Unionists. And there are others better qualified than I in this place, of all places, to talk about their respective legal styles, their styles of advocacy. All I will maybe comment upon is their attitude towards their fees, their payment. Redmond is noteworthy for, in my mind at any rate, for honourably returning a fee in a case which had been settled early. So the fee had been agreed, the case had not turned out to be as protracted and as difficult as had been expected, so he does the honourable thing and returns the money. Carson's attitude towards cash is wholly different. Carson lives in fear of the money running out. His fees are amongst the very highest of the age, and he is direct in demanding his payment. I think with each of them, recent history weighs heavily. I think part of the challenge with Redmond is the extent to which he has to cope with the legacy of the Parnell split, and it's absolutely clear that that's a central motif in terms of the array of political challenges facing him. These challenges can be defined in different ways, but keeping the party together, keeping the constitutional nationalist movement together is clearly a critical priority. Dealing with the British government and the British ministers is another key challenge, and of course dealing with those Northern Unionists is a third. His relentless concern for unity is has of course clear origins. Carson, I think, is also influenced by a degree of division within the recent history of unionism, though in my view James Craig is much more heavily influenced by that legacy of division than Carson is. It is, however, more widely the case, and I don't think this is often underlined, that Carson does have an historical sense. There are historical allusions throughout his speeches. He is influenced, I believe, by a particular historical reading of how successive British governments respond to Irish political mobilisation. And finally, each of them was a compromise leader, and each of them is circumscribed by the compromises involved by their election. Each of them, as I say, is marginal originally to the central concerns of their parties. Redmond is a Parnellite, Carson is a Southern Unionist. And the resulting limits on Redmond's freedom of manoeuvre are well known. But there's also, I think, a very considerable distance between Carson's public certainties and his much more circumspect private behaviour in 1910, 1914. Carson too, I think, has a movement whose unity can't be taken for granted. It was characterised by a degree of social and economic division, which is still, I think, frequently overlooked. And also, I think the unity and apparent homogeneity of unionism in 1910, 1914 shouldn't be taken at face value. There is a sense in which I think we still interpret unionism in these years of the Third Home Rule crisis on its own terms, that is to say, through the inflection of the propaganda that they produced at the time, propaganda which emphasised unity and homogeneity. Each of them works within these different sets of personal legacies, but I want to take just a couple of minutes before concluding and say something about what their careers say about the wider cultures of the Union state that they're operating within. One of the things that has struck me in revisiting the array of their correspondence is the degree of friendship I think that they frequently exhibited. But this is complemented as well by what I think is a significant lacuna. And that lacuna is that there is very little evidence of substantive private negotiation between the two of them. Each of them naturally turn to their British parliamentary and ministerial minders. Each of them look primarily to the British parties to clinch the deal, as it were. And for each of them, I think this carries an ongoing risk of dependency or of clientelism. And this in the past is offset by highly competent personalities like those of O'Connell and Parnell. Carson, I think, has clear advantages over Redmond in terms of the set of circumstances that he has to navigate. The British Tories are divided in this era, divided interestingly over issues which have a certain contemporary resonance, that's to say free trade, tariff reform. What is tariff reform if not a kind of foreshadowing of some of the issues bound up with Brexit? They use unionism, Irish unionism, in 1910, 1914 as a mechanism, as one of several mechanisms around which party unity is reconstructed. And again, I don't want to push the parallels between the situation in the years before the First World War and Theresa May's embrace of Arlene Foster, but there's some prefiguring. I think really what I'm seeking to say is that the Conservatives' dependence upon unionism in 1910, 1914 is to my mind, self-evident. And the situation between Redmond and the Liberals is different. Redmond clearly supplies numbers and support for the Liberal government. But it's hard to escape the impression that Asquith and many of the Liberals' visceral commitment to Home Rule and Irish nationalism isn't really there. And Asquith himself says in 1913 quite clearly that in a sense the shoe is on the other foot. The nationalists without the support of the Liberal Party were powerless. So Redmond's essential difficulty, and it's a profound difficulty, was that he was coping with a still fragile constitutional nationalist tradition. Again, think of the O'Briens and the Healeys, and seeking to collaborate with a broadly united liberalism which was sympathetic towards but not really desperately passionate about Home Rule. And in the end, I think Redmond and Carson's fundamental characteristic was that they reflected the hybridity, as I would call it, of Irish political culture under the Union. The Janus-faced looking to Union and metropolitan themes, imperial themes, as well as to the national. And again, this shouldn't come as a great surprise unless you're judging each of them by the standards of, in Carson's case, an essentialist Britishness, or judging each of them from the point of view of a partitioned Ireland. Work on identity in other multinational union states conventionally emphasises the contingencies and the linkages and layers within political identity. And lastly, because I don't want to spend too much more time just in the first of my contributions. Why does all of this matter now? Well, I've given some hints as to why I think it matters now. I think there are some possible parallels between the politics of the era of Redmond and Carson, 1910, 1914 in particular, and the current politics of Brexit as they affect both the neighbouring island as well as Ireland. And I think some of the passions that one sees in terms of Home Rule in 1910, 1914, a time when the British state, the United Kingdom state, wobbles, comes close to the abyss of civil conflagration. I think one sees some of those passions in terms of, and some of the potential threats to the existing constitutional configuration of the existing United Kingdom, one sees that now. The period was one of passion for Carson's Conservative allies, and I've talked a little bit about the ways in which arguably tariff reform and the issues of debate within conservatism on free trade and tariff reform look forward to the divisions over Brexit, and again the ways in which these internal divisions have reconfigured the Tories' relationship with their Irish, now their Northern Irish allies or putative allies. The period brings forward the issue, of course, of a projected border between a nationalist Ireland and a unionist Ireland. The disputes over hard and soft borders in the light of Brexit are a distant legacy of these years of Home Rule. But the era not only defined issues and problems of lasting importance, it also threw up, at least so far as the British are concerned, some perhaps projected solutions which remain in play. There were different forms of and different versions of what constituted partition in play between 1910 and 1920. For example, the partition envisioned in 1914 is a very, very different form of division from that which is ultimately enacted. Many, including both these men, Carson and Redmond, looked to the possibilities enshrined within the notion of federalism as a reconciling concept, and this is still very much relevant in terms of potential reconciliation between Scottish nationalism and the United Kingdom state. So in essence, it seems to me that 1910, 1914 produced, at the risk of a crude alliteration, passions, problems and plans or solutions which have an ongoing resonance. Thank you.
Frank. Yes. Come forward. Thank you.
In his conjoint biography of Redmond and Carson, a project that is full of problems and pitfalls, Alvin Jackson has succeeded resoundingly. It marks a further stage in his project of identifying what was common to nationalism and loyalism in Ireland, on which he embarked in his Home Rule, an Irish History, published in 2008, which treated as Home Rule as a North and South phenomenon, the unionist, loyalist paradigm being also a form of Home Rule. His driving aperçu is more forceful than I initially thought it could be, and contemporary events as the drama of Brexit plays out in Northern Ireland, and as what once seemed the fixed contours of Northern Ireland continue to change shape, validate and affirm his remarkable prescience. The dreary steeples of which Winston Churchill wrote are unexpectedly bathed in a whirl of European searchlights. One of the singular merits of this book is its treatment of Carson's barristeriality. He lived in the high era of the extrovert advocate, where the gamble was part of the great game to the end. Rien ne va plus. Alvin's argument on this is that Carson carried into politics the culture of the law courts, and he brought qualities of individuality, theatricality, brinkmanship, and boldness to the political stage. Alvin, I think, pushes this point exactly as far as it goes. While it does not capture the central truth, one can get a certain distance, a considerable distance, in construing Carson's relation to unionism, and especially to Northern unionism, as that of a relationship of barrister and client, and one that was marked by a certain disproportionality. We live in an age in which politicians are routinely denigrated. In relation to the bar, politics is the greater calling, not just because of its more direct public import, but because the odds are much worse. If barristers can have highly successful political careers, they tend to remain in some degree marked apart, not quite belonging to the generality of politicians. Barrister politicians are not exclusively steeped in politics and maintain lines of retreat to professional practice or judicial office. Perhaps we don't give enough attention to the confederacy of Carson and Birkenhead, both leading advocates in the extra-constitutional resistance to Home Rule in what became Northern Ireland. I think it was Francis Cruz O'Brien who said of T.M. Healy that he had the mind, nay, the soul of a barrister. One can wonder whether Carson was in some sense existentially a barrister. It is more, I think, that he was a less than fully integrated political persona. I say that by reason of his treatment of Southern as against Northern unionism. On partition he had perhaps as little choice as Redmond, but it was something on which he harboured some misgivings. I say it also by reason of his temperamental inability to observe political collegiality in his 2 periods of cabinet office. One could endlessly posit correlations of the character traits of barrister politicians to their professional background, but not necessarily to cogent effect. One tends to forget, for example, that Asquith was a barrister who, as junior counsel at the Special Commission, took Parnell through his evidence-in-chief. John Maynard Keynes had a devastating criticism of Asquith, with whom he was friendly, which is cited by Richard Davenport Hines. Keynes believed it a signal mistake of Asquith's to forget about a piece of business once he had signed it off, and not to carry it about with him in his mind and on his tongue when the official day's work was done. One could try to connect that to his formation as a barrister. However, not all barristers would share that approach, and the confident habit that Asquith had was one that had deep roots in his character and his lifestyle. A further merit of Alvin's work, and for me one of its shrewdest insights, is that Redmond's underestimation of Carson and his refusal to take Carson's gambits entirely seriously in the early stages of the Home Rule crisis. That this owed much to the fact that nationalists and unionists struck militant postures in British politics that strangely mirrored each other. There is a balancing proposition that reflects Alvin's mining of what the 2 contestatory movements on the island had in common. And I quote, "Distant from those whom he led, influential with but not beholden to one of the main British parties, Carson himself was not wholly removed from the strategic style and spirit of Parnellism. In his audit of political ironies, Alvin Jackson's audit of political ironies, Carson becomes, at least temperamentally, more of a Parnellite than Redmond. Part of the difficulty in measuring Redmond against Carson, of which Alvin Jackson is fully conscious, is that Redmond had a significantly weaker political hand. Margaret Callanan has written that an appraisal of Redmond's career over the radically different decades across which it extended indicates that it cannot bear the weight of the battles that contemporary polemicists now, today, place upon him and it. Redmond, particularly after the fall of Parnell in 1891, lived in a sphere of narrow choices. He lacked significant agency over the question of Home Rule for most of his political career. Alvin writes, by contrast, of Carson's autonomy of action within the constellation of contemporary unionism. Perhaps the greatest merit of Alvin's analysis is that the contest of Carson and Redmond's leadership of their respective causes is a negative merit. It does not pretend to give a simple answer. It is in that way a response to the instrumentalisation of partition that was once a prominent feature of political discourse in the Irish Republic, of which the current Sinn Féin now has sole ownership, as well as of the historic name of Sinn Féin, whose actual adherents lost it in what has come to appear as an act of conjoint negligence on the part of Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, rather than what it was, the outfall of the Civil War. Ronan Fanning's Fatal Path is an important work, but there's something slightly troubling in the confidence of its argument that Sinn Féin achieved more than the Irish Party could have. It is a plausible proposition, but is at least, in a formal sense, hypothetical and counterfactual, and it involves value judgments that need to be weighed. The issue defies crisply, snappy adjudication. Punditry is not the business of historians. Alvin's patient relativism seems to me a preferable approach. I think history will be kinder to Redmond than the politics of the Irish state have been, at least up until the 1970s, and not just because of the pieties of the commemorative cycle through which we are passing, if we have not actually passed out in. Redmond personally is less enigmatic than relatively impenetrable. He did not possess, and who could, the almost surreal charisma of Parnell. Physically, his aspect of a somewhat paunchy Irish country gentleman did not rival Carson's implacable jaw and grimly set expression, at least photographically. His career, what he witnessed and was part of, from his election for New Ross in 1881, was truly extraordinary. His loyalty to Parnell in the split of 1890 to 91 rendered Parnell's campaign to reconstitute his leadership politically credible, even though Parnell would, as he made absolutely clear, have ploughed on alone if he had to. His commitment to Parnell in the split should never be forgotten. He was adroit in maintaining Fenian support for the Parnellites throughout the 1890s. His career in the split, in Parnell's lifetime and thereafter as leader of the anti-Parnellite minority, seems at first hard to reconcile with his calculated moderation as the leader of the reunited Irish Party from 1900. It's not difficult to explain, however. Redmond was committed to maintaining firstly the cohesion of the Parnellite minority and thereafter of the reunited Irish Party. Temperamentally, he was not expansive. To this was added the constraints of seeking to achieve Home Rule and of maintaining intact the Home Rule movement. He negotiated those constraints with high competence, but it was not to be enough. What he lacked or chose not to exercise was the faculty of self-dramatisation as he negotiated those constraints. To suggest that he should have educated the nationalist public in the possibility of partition is not realistic, but he did need to dramatise his own agony in the struggle for Home Rule, and he entirely lacked the aptitude to do that. The second criticism that might be made of Redmond relates to his imperialism. It is true that Home Rule was a broad platform, and by no means all nationalists were opposed to the British Empire. John Redmond made a speech at the Cambridge Union in 1895 on Irish Home Rule. He expressed his conviction that Home Rule would be the first step in a great system of decentralisation that would devolve to local assemblies' responsibility for local affairs and, quote, thus clear the way for the creation of that great imperial Senate which in future he believed would govern the empire, end quote, whose dominions had been won by Irishmen as much as by Britons. Arthur Griffith, whose own views on empire were anomalous, was constantly to invoke the speech against Redmond. Redmond's views were not so unusual, but then he was the leader of the anti-Parnellite minority and would become in 5 years the leader of the reunited Irish Party. His imperial schema, avowed just a little too explicitly and enthusiastically, did influence his political course, at least at the margin, and informed his famous "wherever the firing line extends" declaration to the East Wicklow volunteers at Woodenbridge on the 20th of September 1914. Redmond's lack of agency, to which Margaret O'Callaghan referred, was pervasive. It was not just that his Westminster options were constrained. The model of the Irish Party as purely a vehicle to obtain legislative change through Home Rule was much more circumscribed than that of a modern political party free to champion a diversity of issues. All other issues were to be deferred to the attainment of Home Rule. All of the Irish Party's eggs were in the Home Rule basket. From 1900, that gave the Irish Party an appearance of intellectual jadedness as a kind of cultural renaissance took place in Ireland. There was a profound difficulty in political mobilisation in Ireland that Parnell had temporarily resolved with the new departure, the élan of which gave Irish nationalism the momentum it maintained through the 1880s. The mobilisation of the North to resist Home Rule cast this in high relief. These were constraints which Redmond inherited, or to which he was ineluctably subject. It was too late to reinvent the Irish Party. The 1916 Rising was directed as much against the Irish Party as against the British government. The fear of the rebels was that Redmond and Home Rule would in fact prevail. This fear we must recognise as having been highly ideological. It was that a bourgeois Irish Party would provide the government of a Home Rule Ireland, that a Home Rule state would not sufficiently acknowledge the Gaelic heritage of the Irish nation, and most of all, that the Irish public would be sated in perpetuity by Home Rule, and that the project of attaining Irish independence would never progress beyond Home Rule. These were pretty thin considerations. The Sinn Féin conception of the finality of a Home Rule settlement far exceeded that of the Irish Party. To this, of course, has to be added the sense among the wider public that Britain had, the wider Irish public, that Britain had failed to make good Gladstone's promise of 1886 and the disenchantments of the Great War. In some ways, it came down to the idea that after the long interval of frustration from 1886, it was better to wrest independence than to have it conceded. That was the thinking of Griffith and the First Dáil. It did not of itself entail a descent into violence. While I am always accused, as this evening, of being a devout Redmondite, it is not something that I disagree with. We need to reconcile ourselves to a large margin of political and ethical indeterminacy in relation to the choices that were made or seized in nationalist Ireland between the suspensive enactment of Home Rule on the 18th of September 1914 and the signing of the treaty on the 6th of December 1921. The debate, at least not repressed or semi-repressed any longer, will outlast us all. What defined and in some way disfigured the politics of the early Irish state was that neither of the sundered factions of Sinn Féin could afford to acknowledge the least continuity with the Irish Party. Cumann na nGaedheal incorporated some of the survivors of the Irish Party. Sean Lemass, in the best sense the most impatient of Irish cliché, here in the King's Inns in February 1966, paid tribute to the Irishmen who had died in the Great War. It is not just the commemorative cycle, but the deep course of Irish politics and of the politics of the European Union that has enabled us to move beyond the straitened politics of the early decades where they were students, that we remember two men who were defined by their adversity, Edward Henry Carson, Baron Carson of Duncairn, and John Edward Redmond. Thank you.
Could I ask James O'Reilly to speak in thanks, please? Oh, I see, I apologise. Yes.
Just when you thought that freedom beckoned to have a finale, Sean has asked me to provide this kind of coda to reflect for 10 or 15 minutes on Carson's place in history. So I would propose to do that by perhaps looking at how that place in history, or that notion of a place in history, can be broken down a little bit, because it seems to me that your esteemed chief executive has set me a daunting challenge in trying to locate Carson in a variety of contexts. So what I want to do, I think, is to think about briefly Carson in terms of nationalist Ireland, in the main part of what I have to say, but I'll begin by commenting a little bit about Carson and his reputation with unionism in the North, because it seems to me that this is a bit more complex than perhaps is readily understood. There's a popular view that Carson was an unqualified hero within the within the unionist North of Ireland. And while this is understandable, I think it's mistaken. And again, I believe it owes something to the success of the unionist mythmakers or propagandists of 1912, 1914, who deliberately manufactured the image of an heroic leader, an heroic Carson, as well as this image of a unified and united and thoroughly mobilised Northern Unionism. And of course there was indeed massive support for Carson's leadership and his stand against Home Rule. But there are other complexities here that deserve a little bit of teasing out as well. You have to recall, I would respectfully suggest that when Home Rule is placed on the statute books in the late summer of 1914, Carson and his unionist support get very little by way of return when Carson pledges the support of the Ulster Volunteers for the British war effort. And this was by no means as automatic a sell within Northern Unionism as might be automatically supposed. There are plenty of police reports, RIC intelligence reports from September 1914, which indicate a clear undercurrent of fast unionist wants to leave his family and to die for King George V and for the Empire. Also, it's easily overlooked that partition is not just about dividing Northern Unionism and Southern nationalism. It's also clearly, of course, about dividing Northern nationalism and Southern nationalism. But one could extend this even further. Partition, six-county partition, is about dividing Ulster Unionism, 6 counties and 9 counties. And it's about dividing Northern Unionism and Southern Unionism. And the idea that this can be achieved without recrimination inside unionism broadly defined in 1916 is just not tenable. Carson faces very significant opposition from within 9-county unionism, or at least the 3 outlying counties of the historic province of Ulster, when he is moving towards doing a deal with Redmond under the aegis of Lloyd George in June 1916. And also Carson's legacy within Northern Unionism is contested. In the 1960s, there is a veritable battle, albeit a low-key battle, between what I might crudely define as mainstream official unionism, led by the relatively liberal Terence O'Neill at that stage, and Paisleyite unionism for the ownership of, in effect, Edward Carson and the men and women of 1910, 1914. And it seems to me that there are parallels or echoes here with the ownership of the 1916 Rising, the ongoing muted and otherwise struggle between the Irish state and the varieties of republicanism for the possession of the soul of Easter Week 1916. So within unionism there is a battle over the possession of Carson and of Carsonite opposition to Home Rule in 1912, 1914. On the whole, the Irish state, it seems to me, has successfully asserted its ownership of the 1916 Rising, not least with what seems to me to have been the success of the centenary celebrations and commemorations of 2 years ago. On the whole, I think in the 1960s, ownership of Carson slipped from beyond mainstream official unionism towards their Paisleyite opponents. David Trimble, for example, coming to the leadership of Northern Unionism in the 1990s and writing as a kind of amateur historian, legal historian and polemicist in the early mid-1990s, specifically looked to James Craig as a paradigm rather than Edward Carson. The argument being that, as Frank has rightly said, Carson has the theatricality and the brinkmanship, but it's Craig who has the constructive achievement in terms of putting together the building blocks of the partition state. Nor does Carson feature in the northern landscape. The heroes of 1916 and of the Revolution are extensively memorialized here within the Republic. But you'll look hard to find, liberals at the time talked about the putative partition state as Carsonia. You'll look hard to find a Carson City outside of Nevada. And what you do find, however, is a commemoration of the first Prime Minister of Northern Ireland, Craigavon. So Craigavon Newtown, the Craigavon Bridge in Derry City, and so on and so forth. Craigavon Hospital. The commemoration of Carson is relatively constricted and, of course, focuses on that statue in front of Stormont in Belfast. How does Carson stand within Irish nationalism and more widely? I think for Irish nationalism, Carson's place is essentially defined as, I think, within clearly the Republican tradition for Redmond. Carson's place in history is defined as being on the wrong side of history. On a range of issues which either were or which have become critical for the majority of Irish people. So even thinking about Carson's legal career, which Frank has correctly brought us back to, Carson is generally seen as the heartless nemesis of Oscar Wilde. In terms of his legal career, two cases routinely stand out: the Wilde trial, the first Wilde trial, and the Archer Shee case, the Winslow Boy case. Of course, Oscar Wilde has emerged as a gay icon, and Carson's supposed prosecution of Wilde, and it's remarkable the longevity of that idea that he prosecuted Wilde. Carson's supposed prosecution of Wilde, therefore, ostensibly places him in a kind of DUP style of fundamentalist evangelicalism when it comes to the issue of LGBT rights. Carson's relationship with violence was and is seen as deeply suspect. Felix, I think, has said that if he didn't introduce the gun into Irish politics, he reintroduced it. And I think there's some force in that suggestion. The corollary of this is that he is blamed for the legacies of Irish violence throughout the 20th century. And I think there is a connection here with a contemporary constitutional nationalist anger against Carson, that he was somehow the man who mucked it all up for Redmond, who delivered 1916. And there is even a constitutional nationalist critique contemporary to 1914-18, which made the argument that not only did Carson deliver the revolution, he also delivered the First World War, because Carson destabilized the Union state, the United Kingdom state, in 1914, and therefore signalled to Kaiser Wilhelm that the British and their empire were there for the taking. He's seen, of course, as the godfather of the division of Ireland through the embrace of partition, inextricably associated with the division of the island. Now, I'm conscious that the sun is shining outside, and I could discourse on each of these headings for some time, despite your resistance. So, with your permission, I will maybe say a few sentences about each of these headings before releasing you, as it were. So let me take this idea, let's kind of look at the wild issue. Because we can, I think, deal with that reasonably straightforwardly. So the question would be, admittedly a somewhat rhetorical question, was Carson the godfather of the conservative evangelical Protestantism, which is clearly an influence on DUP politics? Evangelical Protestantism is an emphatic influence historically within Northern Unionism, but Carson is not part of that tradition. Carson is relatively quiet and understated in terms of his private religious convictions. It's true that his outlook on questions of sexual morality was entirely conventional, as you might expect it to be in terms of the 1890s. However, he wrote privately with some sympathy concerning Wilde's downfall. And he had some interest in the wider theatre scene, actually of the 1890s and Edwardian period, which was an interesting discovery in terms of research for this enterprise. Importantly, Wilde very seriously considered Carson as a prosecuting counsel when he moved against Queensberry in 1895. And reputedly only didn't end up with Carson because Queensberry was rather quicker off the mark in signing Carson up for his defence case. Carson is centrally a highly ambitious lawyer. He takes this key part in one of the most conspicuous trials of the decade. He doesn't take part in the second Wilde trial, and in general he shows, in my excavation and in my view, no political or religious bias in his choice of cases. To give two examples of that proposition. In 1913, at the height of the Home Rule crisis, he defends leading liberals in the Marconi insider share dealing trial, when, if those liberals had fallen, the impact upon the wider liberal government and Home Rule project might well have been real. He defends George Archer Shee at the time that he is embracing the Orange North, as it were. He defends George Archer Shee when he is about to take command of a Northern Unionism inflected as it is with Orangeism. George Archer Shee comes from one of the leading English Catholic lay families, educated at Stonyhurst and with a very substantial network through Stonyhurst. Some Catholics saw the Archer Shee trial, well, the Archer Shee case has been interpreted in many ways, but some Catholics certainly saw it as about establishment bias against their faith. Did Carson introduce the gun into Irish politics? Well, as I've argued elsewhere, there's no doubt that he helped illegally, and from late 1913 onwards it is illegally, to introduce large numbers of guns into Ireland and its politics. He indirectly brought the gun to Redmondite politics in terms of the reaction of the Irish volunteers. But again, as I've argued, he's not the first militant Irish politician or the first to threaten militancy. And I think that the key issue for Carson, or a key issue for Carson in 1912, 1914, is that yes, he imports weapons into the north of Ireland, but above all, he wants to be seen importing weapons into the north of Ireland because there is an audience, there is a jury. That audience is British public opinion, and what he is seeking to do is to apply severe pressure to the British Parliament on the issue of Home Rule. Once again, I think he's pursuing a high-risk brinkmanship, as in the courts. And it's a high-risk brinkmanship which I believe has been an influence, and indeed a baleful influence, in Northern Unionism ever since. Does he reintroduce the gun into Irish politics, as has been suggested? I think this is a more reasonable proposition, but ultimately its force depends upon whether you believe that weaponry had wholly disappeared from Irish politics in 1913, 1914. And it depends too on whether you believe that there was a smooth pathway between Carson's threatened warfare in 1914 and the 1916 Rising and the outbreak of the War of Independence in 1919. Such a view, I think, on balance, certainly in my opinion, gives insufficient punch to the critical role of the First World War in terms of delivering 1916. Was he the man who divided Ireland? I'm not going to dwell much on this. Carson's advocacy of partition is, I think, important in terms of the ultimate division of the island. All I will say is that, all I will do is, I think, to reiterate that which is comparatively well known, which is that for Carson, partition was fundamentally a tactic which became a compromise, which was reimagined in his later life as a fundamental goal. In his early career, he is an all-Ireland unionist. He looks at the early stages of the Home Rule crisis in 1911, 1912 at partition as a tactic, and in later life, and for public consumption as opposed to what he's saying in private, for public consumption, he is the patriarch of the partition state in the north. Privately, he's saying things like, I wish we'd accepted Gladstone's first Home Rule Bill in 1986. Privately, he's saying things like, the Free State dispensation, the Anglo-Irish Treaty, humbug, I'd rather have a republic. Privately, he's saying things like, I have no state to be loyal to. All of this in private correspondence in the later 1920s. So, after a century, I hope that it's worth reuniting these two men. I don't think that either can be fully understood without recourse to the other. I think that Redmond's approach to a succession of fundamental issues such as militancy and partition and the endorsement of the war effort is at least in part conditioned by Carson's actions and strategies. I think Carson's own actions are conditioned by a close reading of Irish nationalism. And it's very interesting looking at the Carson papers in Belfast, the amount of nationalist polemical literature that's in that archive, and which he acquired and clearly examined, as a good barrister would do in terms of research. Redmond played by the parliamentary and political rule book, including the Parnellite rule book, and became clearly a key executor of the great man's complicated legacies. He sought for consistency and honour in his private and public dealings. Carson bent and broke rules and revelled in contradictions while ultimately proclaiming his own directness, his simplicity and consistency. He was at times the lawless lawyer, the disloyal loyalist, the all-Ireland partitionist. Unlike Redmond, Edward Carson lived long enough to rewrite his own history, and I think that's critical. Volumes of his semi-official biography are on display here. I am consistently amazed by the numbers of copies of this 3-volume biography written in the 1930s by Marchbanks and Alvin, which were signed by Edward Carson and distributed to his friends. So he lived long enough to rewrite his own history and to mask the shifts and the failures and the U-turns in his political life. Unlike John Redmond, he lived long enough to impose a form of consistency on a long and inconsistent career whose central themes were simultaneously the law and the breaking of the law. Thank you.
This event this evening, beyond the aegis of the Library Committee of the King's Inns, our soon to retire Under Treasurer, has been a very active member of that committee. In fact, it's fair to say we would not have had this meeting this evening were it not for the interest that Sean has in matters historic. We've been privileged to be present to hear two great historians, one a colleague I know from practice, one I'm meeting here for the first time, even though I've read his book. And I think there's a reception that was to follow, and there may be some questions some of you may have, and it's fair that at least our two speakers have a drink of water before you take. But I do think we should show our appreciation to two great presentations we've been privileged to have this evening.
We'd like to thank everybody for attending and to offer you the opportunity to talk to our two historians informally downstairs, perhaps with a glass of wine in your hand. It is a warm evening, a wonderful one, a great King's Inns occasion. Thank you one and all.
Thank you.